she, as I say, was a pioneer in Judaism and medicine. And her dates, interestingly, vary depending where you look. And you'd have thought that it might be difficult to determine her date of birth, but there's also different dates of death given, either 1983 or 1984, in different sources. But in either case, she lived well into her 90s. This is a picture of her when she was older. I hope I'm going to put up a picture too of her when she was younger in a minute. I don't know, does that appear now, or have I got to share that separately? Tom will tell me. Can you see a picture of her? Or
No, you'll have to share it separately, I think.
share it
Margaret.
separately. So
Sorry.
that's fine. So no problem. I will share again. This isn't a great picture, of obviously, but it's unfortunately the only one I could find of her at a younger age. And you can see two things from it. One is that she wears traditional Indian dress, and that's quite important, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. And the other is that she looks quite serious and determined, I think it's fair to say, and that also is very typical of her. So I'll go back now to the PowerPoint. And explain, first of all, why I've chosen to talk to her. She's somebody I've known about for quite a long time as a remarkable woman. But there's also a family connection, and in fact, it might be stretching it a little bit, but perhaps not too much, that I wouldn't be here now if she hadn't been around, because she founded the Jewish Religious Union in Bombay and made it part of the World Union, and it was through the World Union for Progressive Judaism that my parents met. But there's more also to the family connection, and that's and some of you, I think this will be familiar to oops. My mother was part of the Bene Israel community that Jerusha, Jhirad, was also part of. There are three main Jewish communities in India. There's the Cochin Jews, who are probably the most famous, and they were in the south of India. There's the Bene Israel, who possibly were the longest in India, but were in a way rediscovered by the Cochin Jews, and they hadn't known much about their Jewish identity, but they'd kept a very firm community and knew the Shema and so on. And then the more recent, by more recent I mean in the 19th century, the Baghdadi Jewish community. Anyway, the Bene Israel community was what my mother was part of. And here her father worked on the railways, so there's a picture here of them on the railways. She had four sisters, in fact, but by the time this picture was taken, one of them had already married and moved away. My mother is the second from the left. I shall never remember if she's the second left or the one on the right, because one is my auntie Irene and one's my mum. I think my mum's actually on the right, but they look very alike. Anyway, the important person here is actually Joyce, who's on the far left. Joyce married somebody called Jerry, or strictly speaking, his name was Joseph, but we always knew him as Jerry. And I hope you can all see this plaque on the right of the screen, where sorry, I'm having anyway, which is dedicated to Joseph Jerry Jhirad. He was Jerusha's first cousin, and he was killed in the India-Pakistan War of 1965. But that's a family connection to Jerusha. But no more about my family, because this is about Jerusha. And I'm very grateful to Sophie Jhirad, who some of you may know. She's a member of West Central Liberal Synagogue, and she is Jerusha's niece, and she told me quite a lot about her aunt to supplement in a more personal way what's available on the internet. So she was born in Shivamoga in Karnataka, and she attended boarding school in Pune, now called Pune, spelt differently, which particularly had many Bene Israel girls, and it was a girl boarding school for girls. She was very bright at school. She won all the prizes. It was clear that she would go far, as it were, academically. And her life's ambition was crystallized when she was 12, because she was told that her older sister had had a difficult labor and would have died in childbirth without medical intervention. So she determined at that age not only to go into medicine, but to go into obstetrics and gynecology. So I'm just going to have to sort my screen out a moment, so excuse me, because okay. Right, hopefully that'll be better. Okay, so this is a picture of a high school for girls. I'm not sure if that's the one she attended, but I think it gives you a picture. This is certainly one where one of her contemporary Bene Israel Jewish girls attended, and it gives you a picture. It was, a very high class education. But having said that, her parents weren't wealthy, and she relied on scholarships. And again, this tells you a lot about India as well, because she had scholarships from Hindus, Muslims, and Parsis, which is a reflection of how things were in India, particularly pre-partition, when different communities all worked together, supported each other. So, having decided to study medicine, she studied in India at a medical school for women. And then women were actually encouraged to study medicine in India, because Indian women would prefer not to see a male doctor, and sometimes actually refuse to see male doctors, which obviously had devastating consequences for their health. So women doctors were encouraged to study medicine. But there were limits to how far they could study, and she wanted to go to London for further study. But government scholarships at the time were only for men. So she applied, and in fact was granted a scholarship from Tata, who are still going strong, the tea plantation firm who now own Jaguar in the Midlands as well. Anyway, she had a scholarship from them, but then someone asked her to apply for a government scholarship, and it seems that there was a man unknown who wanted to make her a test case that the rules should be changed. And in fact, her application was successful, and she paved the way for other women. And she went to Britain before the First World War. And terrible as it was, that actually also paved the way, because, of course, so many men went to the front, including doctors. So, in fact, they desperately needed doctors in Britain. So it gave her much more experience, and she remained in Britain for the period of the First World War. And then at the end of that period, she became the first Indian woman to obtain an MD in obstetrics. So while she was in London, she met the so-called three M's, Montefiore, Montague, and Mattock. It's not clear whether she also met Israel Abraham. I imagine she would have done, because Israel Abraham, as some of you know, was the forgotten founder because his name didn't begin with M. But anyway, she probably met him too. But certainly, particularly Lily Montague was a great influence on her. And the philosophy and practice of liberal Judaism appealed to her, so that when she returned to Bombay, as it was now, present-day Mumbai, she founded the Jewish Religious Union in Bombay, in India. And again, that was quite a remarkable thing for a woman to do, because, you know, the Indian Jewish community, like India as a whole, was pretty much male-dominated. But she was determined, she had a vision, and so she founded this community. Differently from Britain, relationships with the Orthodox were good, though it's a much more tolerant form of Judaism in India, and it probably is even wrong to call it Orthodox, I think, because the Bene Israel are particularly liberal in terms of their Judaism. But nevertheless, founding a congregation where the women were equal, where services were partly in English, and it would have been in English at that time because certainly the Bene Israel, many of them worked for the British. My own grandfather worked for the railways and spoke English, so there would have been services in English, as there are to the present day. But weddings would take place in Orthodox synagogues, and at first services took place in the flat of what was called the Bene Israel Sri Mandla, which she had founded. And I'll say a little bit more about that again shortly. She also gave sermons at the services. I don't know if she actually led services other than to give sermons. She didn't actually learn Hebrew at school because apparently in order to learn Hebrew, you had to pay for Hebrew lessons, and her parents, as I've mentioned, were poor. So she didn't actually learn Hebrew. I don't know if she learned it at later life, but she didn't learn it at school. So she helped, in 1926, Lily Montague founded the World Union, and she helped Lily to do this, and particularly to help India be a part of it. And apparently throughout her life, she maintained a regular correspondence with Claude Montefiore and Lily Montague. Her niece Sophie didn't know what had happened to it, and obviously it'd be a treasure trove if we could find it, but I don't know whether it was destroyed or whether it's still hidden in somebody's attic in India. And the Jewish Religious Union flourished, and in the 1950s, its membership was as high as 350. Her Judaism was important to her. She always was proud of her Jewish identity, and it meant a lot to her. And if she had to treat a private patient on Shabbat, apparently she would always give the fee to charity. I couldn't help adding a little line here in brackets that at the time in the 1950s, my mother's family, my mother was a treasurer, her sister Winnie was a secretary, and her brother George was the chair of the JRU. Here I have a picture of Lily and of Israel Matuk and of Leo Beck. I don't know if Jerusha ever met Leo Beck, but certainly Lily Montague and Claude Montefiore, Israel Matuk, sorry, and of course Claude Montefiore. So a little bit more about her medical career. She started a consulting practice in Bombay because she had work in a government hospital, but that wasn't sufficient income. It was generally recognised that anybody who worked for a government hospital would also have a private practice. And in 1920, she was called to the Lady Hardinge College and Hospital in Delhi, which was a medical school that was started in 1916 for women specifically. So very early on in the history of that college, she became involved. But she wasn't really happy in Delhi, and then she moved to a small hospital in Bangalore, a senior surgeon. And while she was there, she already began to see beyond the practice of obstetrics as a surgeon, and she set up antenatal, intranatal, and postnatal care, which was really revolutionary. And she went far beyond that. She organized a blood bank, and would, with her staff, would actually match the blood as well, because they didn't have technicians to do that work. And then she returned in 1924 to Bombay, where she was happiest. And she spent the rest of her career at the Karma Hospital. That's a picture of it here. I don't know if it's still there like that, but it probably is. And it was built at the end of the 19th century as a hospital exclusively for women and children. And as I say, that met a need because women were very reluctant to be treated in spaces where men were. So that was a very important hospital. So she didn't separate her medical work from the circumstances in which women lived. And again, she was, I think, revolutionary in putting the two together. So she took an interest in mother and childcare throughout India. And she took an interest of the problems of women in Purdah, let's say women who secluded themselves. She discovered a link with osteomalacia, which is a vitamin D deficiency because they weren't exposed to the sunlight. And that led to soft bones and pelvic deformities, and of course made births very difficult. So she realized the importance of making those connections with social factors. She also advocated changing public opinion about child marriage, and she advocated education about sexual relationships so that women would know what was happening, and also about birth control. And she also worked with the traditional, I must admit, I don't know how you pronounce this, dyes, I think, but do correct me if anybody knows. And they were like traditional midwives, and it's interestingly how we're still wrestling with some of the problems she wrestled with in many parts of the world, and I think have realized long after she did that you can't just dismiss traditional practices and traditional health workers. You have to involve them in the changes that you make. So rather than tell these traditional dyes that they weren't doing any good and dismiss them and tell women not to rely on them, she realized that women did rely on them, and faced with the choice between relying on women they knew and some revolutionary young doctor, they would choose to listen to the women they knew. So she worked with them to change some of their practice, such as unhygienic practices, and realized that they have to be part of the change. She also, again in a radical way, undertook a survey of maternal deaths in Bombay. And she realized that maternal deaths were at least twice as high in the poorer areas than in the more wealthy areas. Again, something that we're still dealing with, that, inequalities, particularly in maternal deaths, even in this country. And she went on to campaign for improved housing and affordable food and education because she realized that all those factors would affect maternal deaths. And she also campaigned for married women doctors to continue to work, and advocated changes such as childcare to be available to enable this. Again, way ahead of her time. So when she was in Bombay, she became the first Indian to be appointed head of a hospital. So, of course, until 1947, the British controlled everything in India. So she had that achievement of being the first Indian woman to be appointed the head of a hospital, the Karma Hospital. And as I said, she was employed by the government, so she needed private practice. But as Sophie told me, she was always clear to private practice that her hospital patients came first, and she wouldn't charge a fee if the patient couldn't afford it. And then for the Golden Jubilee of the Karma Hospital, she returned to Britain to fundraise, and that enabled the hospital to build laboratories and a library and an X-ray department. And her work continued beyond her retirement. So here are just some of her achievements. As I said, she was the first Indian to serve as a medical officer at the Karma Hospital. And because of all her efforts on behalf of the library and also of her efforts in medical education, the postgraduate library at the Karma Hospital is named in her honour. She was president of the Association of Medical Women in India for 10 years, 1947 to 1957, and she was also a founder member of the Federation of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And she was a chair of the Maternity and Child Welfare Advisory Committee of the Indian Council of Medical Research. She was also elected Fellow of the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 1947, which, to become a Fellow of a Royal College, is a very high honour awarded to people of particular distinction in the speciality. And in 1945, she was awarded the MBE, which seems to me rather paltry, given the scale of her achievements, really. I think, had she been a man in this country with similar achievements, she'd have been given an OBE at the very least. But anyway, she was awarded an MBE. She was also bestowed the Padma Shri Award by the Government of India in 1966. So those of you who know me will know that I tend to talk quite a lot about Lily Montague. So I hope you'll excuse me talking about her again, but it just strikes me that they were two of a kind. And Lily Montague undoubtedly influenced Jerusha in her work for liberal Judaism. But they have other similarities as well. She was deeply concerned about social conditions, as we've seen. She recognized that health and social conditions went hand in hand, and that if you really wanted to improve health, you needed to improve social conditions as well. And actually, she, like Lily again, she worked with her sister. So Jerusha worked with her sister Leah, and they worked for the Bene Israel Mandla, which was a women's organization which ran classes in sewing and cooking and Hebrew. And this enabled women who were married as well to earn some money within their homes. And again, this is sort of similar to Lily Montague's work in her youth clubs and her clubs for girls. And later, these Sri Mangla opened to other communities as well, so she worked well beyond the Jewish community. Both Lily Montague and Jerusha Jhirad used their personality and their intellect to create a new form of Judaism. And when Sophie told me that Jerusha Jhirad had a real sense of presence, I think you can start to imagine she was a small woman in stature, and there's a story of how she confronted people much taller than her when she felt the need to do so from a professional point of view, and she was fearless in doing what she felt was right. Neither married, but rather they dedicated their lives to their chosen work. Neither cared about material possessions. They dressed simply. People can tell you about how Lily Montague really didn't ever dress up. And you can see that Jerusha wore simple Indian dress. And again, I think that's partly that she didn't care too much dress up, but also because she wanted to relate to the women that she was treated, as well as the fact that Bene Israel women often did wear and still do wear traditional Indian dress today. And they both continued their work into the late 80s, and they leave an enduring legacy. In this country, we know about Lily Montague. In India, certainly Jerusha has got some recognition. There've been articles about her in medical journals. And as a final sign of that recognition, I think this last slide shows you, this is a crater on Venus named after, well, this isn't the crater, this is Venus, the planet Venus. And it's named after Jerusha Jhirad. And there was a very interesting article in her Haaretz, you can Google it actually, which describes how 3 craters on Venus are named after 3 Bene Israel women who did amazing work in India. So her legacy lives on in many ways. I think she's a very inspiring example of a woman who did great things through force of personality, determination, and intelligence. And I'm very happy to hear your questions about her now. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer them, I have to say, because I'm not, I haven't actually read, there is a biography of her that I haven't read, but I'll do my best. And we've got some time for discussion as well. So I'll end there and be glad to join you in discussion. I'm reminding you that if you do have a question, you can use the raised hand function, which you'll find under reactions at the bottom of your screen. So if you do have a question, please just ask it, or a comment, as I said. It's much of interest. Had any of you heard of her before?
I think we have a question from Michael. Michael, are you there? So I have a question coming directly to me on the chat as well. Is the Kama Hospital the same as the hospital in the TV series?
Oh gosh, which TV series? I've no idea. Sorry,
I don't know. The question's from Gail Davis.
Gail, do you want to say more?
It's a play on ITV, apparently. But if you haven't seen it, I don't know how you can answer.
I don't know.
Sorry, Michael did come join us for a second, and then I think we lost him again. Michael, I think we have you. We can't hear you, Michael.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. I've got my camera switched on, but I'm shuffling around the house as I speak. I think what great talk. Thank you very much. It was really quite inspiring, very inspiring, in fact. But have I got a question? Yes. I'll tell you what it's about. My grandmother was Anglo-Indian. Her mother was Indian, my great-grandmother, and my great-grandfather was a British officer in the army. Anglo-Indian children didn't have a great time, because they were mixed race. Either they were in limbo, really, not really accepted by Indians, not really accepted by white British. And she was brought up in tragic circumstances, brought up in one of the Dr. Graham's children's homes, which were in the sort of well-publicised children's homes that were brought in the north of India. And this would be around about the probably around about the 1920s, 1930s. Was Jerusha, was she involved with her work around about that time at all?
Yep.
Yeah.
So she started so she was in Britain during the First World War,
Yeah.
returned to England, India in 1919. So she
Yeah.
would have been, I mean, at the time she was first Delhi and then Bangalore and then in Mumbai.
Yes.
I mean, whether she had anything to do with the children's homes, I don't know. Certainly, mother and child welfare, she was concerned throughout. But it's terribly sad to hear about. You said your grandmother.
Yes, my grandmother. Yes.
Yeah.
She was brought up in one of the Dr. Graham's children's homes. I mean, it was quite tragic circumstances that she ended up there. Well, actually, I'll spell it out. My great grandfather, who was a British officer, the story I have is that he murdered, my great grandmother.
Oh goodness.
And he ended up back in the UK, and so there was whether it went to a court or not, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. But that's how my grandmother and her siblings ended up in, and they had anglicised names. I mean, they were obviously with a British father. So they didn't have Indian names. But yeah, it's just when I hear things about India or listen to talks that we just listened to, of course it automatically in my head takes me geographically to that region, because I have some personal connection with it,
No, I absolutely understand that.
My grandmother.
I mean, it's interesting, this question about being anglicised, because my mother's family was very anglicised, and
yes,
her name was Rose Solomon. I always knew her by that, but there was
yes,
also
yes,
an Indian name for the family,
yes,
which is related to the work they did and or the
yes,
place they came from. Very often, the place they came from.
yes.
So it's very interesting, this sort of tension between being Indian and being British, which was felt even by the Bene Israel who worked for the British, I think. Yeah, but thank you for telling me.
Yeah.
It's very
Well,
moving.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I also had something coming directly to me from Janet. Janet Bray, who was wondering if she visited the UK very often.
As far as I know, she only made those 2 visits. So she had the long stay during the First World War, and then she came in the 1930s to fundraise. I'm not aware that she came again, but I'm not sure. But certainly she had this ongoing correspondence, with Claude Montefiore and Lily Montague. So she kept very much in touch with events in Britain. And she followed British journals as well. So she kept that link too. And I imagine she must have had correspondence with her medical colleagues, but I don't know.
Okay, any other questions?
like a short evening.
It's just not very chatty this evening. That's it's early night for me.
Well,
okay, well,
Brian
sorry, Margaret, you finish.
said in the chat that LGS has got a discussion this Tuesday about the Jews of India. So, Brian, I don't know if you want to put more details in the chat, because it is a fascinating history. And if you read
I think Brian is trying to give us more details, but Brian, it's not very good sound.
I think if
Maybe
you
if you could type it in the chat.
Brian, could you do that?
Right. Try and do that one.
Oh, Judith, thank you. I think if you can track down the Haaretz article, as I can't give you the link offhand, but if you Google Jerusha Jhirad Venus crater, you'll get it, and you'll find there 2 other Bene Israel women described who are fascinating as well. And I think there are a lot of lives there still to be discovered, and a history needs to be written.
Can you hear me, Margaret?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Judith.
I don't. We've got Tuesday texts this week. Dov is talking about the history of the Jews of India.
So should people go to the LGS website to hear more, find out more?
Yes, yes.
Great.
And it's on Zoom.
Brilliant.
It's at 11:15.
Lovely.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, actually, I have another question actually, and I've just thought about it just now. Did Jerusha, did she ever by any chance her and the Mother Teresa ever move in the similar circles at all? Did they ever cross paths?
Oh, what an interesting question. Because Mother Teresa was in Calcutta.
She was in Calcutta, yeah. Calcutta, yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean they didn't at all. I'd love to know. I don't know. Thank you, Tom. That was quick work. You've put the article on. So if anybody wants to see the article in Haaretz, Tom has very kindly found it already.
Yes, it is now in the chat. I'm getting lots of lovely messages for you, Margaret, directly to me about thanking you for an interesting talk. I think disabling and then enabling the chat meant that people just continued to message just me. But I will pass them along to you afterwards.
There is a few on to everybody, so it's interesting. But anyway, thank you very much.